In the scorching expanse of the Charon wastes, a desert stretching endlessly beneath the relentless glare of two suns, Rensalas found the peace he had long sought after years of military service. For him, this isolation was freedom, a place where the harshness of the world faded into the simplicity of survival. Yet the quiet was abruptly broken one afternoon when a fiery object streaked across the sky, trailing smoke and flames before crashing somewhere beyond the dunes. Rin had seen meteor showers before, but this was different, its trajectory too controlled, too deliberate. Against his better judgment, he climbed onto his hoverbike and sped toward the plume of smoke rising in the distance. Upon arrival, the scene before him was otherworldly. A small spacecraft, its hull glowing with residual heat, lay half buried in a crater. Alien technology and twisted metal were strewn across the desert floor. Instinct told him to leave, but something made him stay. Among the wreckage, he saw her, an alien woman, her silver skin marred by glowing, pulsing wounds, barely clinging to life. Sirin Varel lay crumpled amidst the debris, her breath shallow and uneven. Her shimmering metallic skin, now streaked with deep gashes, gave off a faint, flickering light. Rin hesitated, torn between caution and compassion. This was no ordinary encounter, and the risks of helping her were immense. But something in her frail state stirred an impulse in him that he couldn't ignore. Carefully stepping over the scattered fragments of alien technology, Rin knelt beside her. She was barely conscious, her violet eyes fluttering open only to close again in exhaustion. He wasn't sure how to help an alien being, but leaving her here to die felt wrong. With surprising gentleness, he lifted her into his arms. She was impossibly light, her body limp but still breathing, if only faintly. Rin draped his worn jacket over her to shield her from the brutal suns and carried her to his hoverbike. As he revved the engine and sped back toward his remote outpost, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would lead him into something far more dangerous than the desert's blistering heat. At his camp, hidden between the jagged cliffs of the Helion Range, Rin laid Sirin on a cot inside his tent. Her breathing remained shallow, and the glowing wounds across her body radiated a strange, unsettling energy. Unsure of what else to do, Rin grabbed his medkit and set to work. He wasn't certain how much human medicine would help her, but he had to try. He cleaned her wounds with antiseptic, the glowing substance oozing from her injuries unnerving him. Her skin was cool to the touch, like metal left in the shade for too long. As he dribbled water over her cracked lips, she stirred slightly, a small sign of life that gave him hope. "Hang in there," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Hours passed, and as the twin suns began to set, casting long shadows over the camp, Rin sat beside her, watching over her fragile form. Her breathing steadied, but the glow of her wounds still pulsed with an otherworldly light. As night fell, Rin couldn't help but wonder who she was, why she had crashed here, and what kind of trouble would soon come looking for her. Morning came, and with it, the desert's unforgiving heat. As Ren prepared a simple breakfast of rehydrated rations, a soft rustling behind him made him turn. Sirin was waking. Her eyes, now open, shimmered with a deep violet hue, flecked with silver, like stars caught in the night sky. She struggled to sit up, grimacing in pain as her hand went to her side, feeling the bandages Rin had wrapped around her. "Easy," he said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're hurt." "I'm not going to hurt you." She stared at him, confusion clouding her gaze. But there was something else there too, relief, perhaps. "Human," she whispered, the word wrapped in a strange melodic accent. Rin nodded. "Yeah, I found you. You crash-landed out there in the wastes. Her gaze flickered to the bandages again, then back to him. "You saved me," she murmured, her voice laced with disbelief. Ren shrugged. "Didn't feel like I had much of a choice." There was a pause as she processed his words, studying him with those ethereal eyes. Finally, she spoke again, her voice stronger but still fragile. "I am Siren of House Varel. My father rules the Dominion. I defied him." As the weight of her words settled between them, Rin realized the gravity of what he'd stumbled into. Siren wasn't just any alien, she was royalty, and she had been cast out by the most powerful regime in the galaxy. "A princess," Rin said, trying to mask his growing unease. Siren lowered her gaze, her voice trembling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "I opposed my father's rule, his cruelty. Now I am marked for death." Rin ran a hand through his dust-covered hair, his mind racing. "So they sent you here to die in the middle of nowhere?" Siren's eyes darkened with pain, though whether from her injuries or the memory of her betrayal, Rin couldn't tell. "I thought I could change things," she whispered, but I was wrong. The realization hit Rin like a punch to the gut. He had unwittingly saved a fugitive, an alien princess, no less, and now her enemies would be coming. But as Ren looked into her eyes, filled with equal parts fear and determination, he made a decision. "You're not dead yet," he said, his voice steady. "And I'm not letting them finish the job." Siren blinked, surprised by his resolve. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile bond, born of shared survival. Over the next few days, Siren's strength slowly returned. Her alien physiology healed at an astonishing rate, though her wounds still left faint, glowing scars on her silver skin. During her recovery, she told Rin more about her world, the Dominion, an empire spanning entire star systems, ruled by her father with an iron fist. Siren had tried to challenge the regime, speaking out for those oppressed under its brutal rule. But her defiance had made her enemies, even within her own family. "They called me a traitor," Siren said one evening, as they sat by the campfire, her voice low and filled with bitterness. "My father fears me. He fears what I represent." Rin, who had seen his fair share of power struggles in his time, shook his head in disbelief. "So he just left you to die out here?" Siren's gaze hardened, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." In his eyes, rebellion deserves no mercy. Rin clenched his fists, anger rising in his chest at the thought of a father abandoning his own daughter. But there was little time to dwell on it. They both knew that the forces of the Dominion would soon come for her. When dawn broke, the rumble of engines echoed across the wastes. Rin and Siren crouched behind a rocky outcrop, watching as sleek black vessels descended from the sky, carrying Dominion soldiers in their gleaming exoskeletal armor. "Elite hunters," Siren whispered, her voice filled with dread. "My father must be desperate to end this." Rin tightened his grip on his rifle, his face hard with determination. "Then we don't run, we fight." The battle began with a calculated strike. Rin detonated the first of their traps, sending a cloud of sand and debris into the air, disorienting the approaching soldiers. Siren moved with deadly precision, her alien agility allowing her to strike and vanish before the soldiers could react. Together they fought side by side, each attack a seamless blend of their unique skills. But the Dominion forces were relentless, regrouping quickly and pressing forward with brutal efficiency. For every soldier they brought down, two more seemed to take their place. As plasma fire rained down around them, Rin knew they couldn't hold out forever. With the odds stacked against them, Rin and Siren retreated deeper into the canyon. "We need to separate them," Siren called out over the roar of plasma fire. Rin nodded, knowing their only chance was to divide the Dominion forces. "Cover me," he shouted, darting out from cover and drawing the attention of the soldiers. Sirin provided suppressing fire, her shots precise and lethal, as Ren led the soldiers into the narrow pass where they had set their final trap. As the first wave of troops entered the kill zone, Ren hit the detonator. The explosion tore through the canyon, sending rocks and bodies flying in every direction. For a brief moment, everything was chaos. When the dust settled, Ren and Sirin stood victorious amidst the wreckage. But their victory was short-lived. A low hum filled the air, and when Ren looked up, his heart sank. A massive Dominion warship hovered above them, casting a dark shadow over the canyon. Reinforcements had arrived, and this time they wouldn't be so easily defeated. As the warship descended, massive war droids followed, their towering frames bristling with plasma cannons and energy shields. Ren and Sirin exchanged a glance, both knowing this could be their last stand. "Ready?" Ren asked, gripping his rifle tightly. Sirin nodded, her gaze fierce. "Let's give them a reason to remember us together." They moved into action. Sirin darted through the battlefield, her alien agility allowing her to evade the onslaught of plasma fire. Meanwhile, Ren targeted the droids, aiming for the joints where their armor was weakest. But despite their best efforts, the Dominion forces pressed on, their sheer numbers overwhelming. "We can't hold them off like this," Ren shouted as they took cover behind a boulder. Sirin's eyes flicked to the hovering warship. "If we can disable the engines, we might have a chance." Ren's mind raced. "There's an old fuel depot in the next canyon. If we lure them there and blow it, we could take out the ship." It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. While Sirin kept the soldiers occupied, Ren made his way to the fuel depot, setting the charges as quickly as his shaking hands would allow. Every second felt like an eternity, the sounds of battle growing closer with each passing moment. Finally, the charges were set. Ren sprinted back to Sirin's position, his heart pounding in his chest. "Go," he shouted, pulling her toward the canyon as the Dominion forces pursued them. Plasma bolts whizzed past, and the ground trembled beneath the heavy steps of the war droids. Just as they reached the edge of the canyon, Ren hit the detonator. The explosion was deafening, a massive fireball engulfing the fuel depot and sending a shockwave through the canyon. The Dominion warship shuddered as the blast reached its engines, and with a final, earth-shaking roar, the ship crashed into the canyon below. For a moment, everything was still. Then, as the smoke began to clear, Ren and Sirin stood victorious. The battle was over, but they both knew it was only the beginning. As they stood atop the ridge, looking out over the wreckage of the Dominion forces, the once desolate Karan wastes now felt like a place of freedom. Ren wiped the sweat from his brow, glancing over at Sirin. Her silver skin, once marred by glowing wounds, had healed, though faint scars remained. She was covered in dust and sweat, but her eyes, those violet eyes, now filled with hope, shone brighter than ever. "We did it," Ren said, his voice filled with disbelief and relief. Sirin nodded, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "For now," she said quietly. Ren knew she was right. The Dominion wouldn't stop. They would send more soldiers, more ships. But for the first time, the thought didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a challenge. As the sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the desert, Sirin turned to Ren, her expression softening. "You've given me something I thought I lost long ago," she said. "What's that?" Ren asked, his voice low. "Hope," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Together they walked into the night, ready to face whatever the galaxy had in store for them. As the stars began to flicker into view above the Charon wastes, Rin and Sirin trekked through the cooling desert sands, their steps purposeful but weary. The battle had drained them both, but something deeper than exhaustion kept them moving. For Rin, it was the weight of responsibility. He hadn't just saved Sirin, he had allied himself with her cause. For Sirin, it was the dawning realization that she was no longer alone. Together they had faced the might of the Dominion, and while they had won this battle, the war was far from over. "We need to find a place to regroup," Rin said, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter. "Somewhere off the grid. The Dominion's going to send everything they have once they realize their forces are gone." Sirin nodded, her violet eyes reflecting the dim starlight. "There's an abandoned mining colony not far from here, hidden in the mountains. It hasn't been used in decades, but the old tunnels could provide cover." Rin raised an eyebrow, surprised by her knowledge of such a remote place. "How do you know about that?" Sirin offered a small, enigmatic smile. "I've spent my life studying every corner of the galaxy, preparing for the day I would need to disappear. The journey to the mining colony took the better part of the night. By the time they arrived, the twin suns were just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the rocky peaks. The entrance to the mine was concealed by debris and overgrown desert plants, but Sirin led the way with confidence. Inside, the air was cool and still, the silence broken only by the occasional drip of water from the old support beams. "This place feels forgotten," Ren murmured, his voice echoing softly in the cavernous tunnels. "That's why it's perfect," Sirin replied, her gaze drifting over the rusted mining equipment left behind. "No one will think to look for us here." They set up a temporary camp in one of the larger chambers, the walls carved smooth by long-abandoned drills. As they rested, Sirin began to explain more about her father, High Lord Kain Drex, and the Dominion's iron grip on the galaxy. She spoke of entire star systems under his rule, oppressed by military might and fear. "He'll stop at nothing to maintain control," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "Anyone who threatens his power is eliminated." Ryan listened in silence, his mind working through the gravity of what they were up against. "And you really thought you could change all that on your own?" Sirin's eyes flickered with a mix of defiance and regret. "I had to try. I believed that if I could rally enough of the Dominion's people, if I could show them there was another way. But I underestimated my father's reach. Now, I'm nothing more than a fugitive." Rin shook his head. "You're not nothing. Not to me. And you're not alone anymore." The words hung between them, a quiet promise in the darkness of the cave. As the days passed, Rin and Sirin fortified their hideout, using the mining equipment to build makeshift defenses. They repaired old security systems, setting up motion sensors at the mine's entrance, and stockpiled whatever weapons they could salvage. Despite the constant threat of discovery, the time spent together brought them closer. They sparred daily, blending Rin's disciplined military techniques with Sirin's swift, fluid alien combat style. And in the evenings they talked, sometimes about strategy, other times about their pasts. One night, as they sat by a small fire, Sirin opened up about her mother, who had died when she was young. "She was the only one who ever stood up to my father," Sirin said quietly, her gaze distant. "But after she was gone, he became even more ruthless. That's when I realized that if I didn't act, no one would." Rin stared into the flames, the crackling fire casting shadows over his face. "I never knew my parents," he said after a long pause. "The war took them before I was old enough to remember. I grew up fighting. It's the only thing I've ever known." For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of their shared losses hanging heavy in the air. Then Siren spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe we can change that. Together before Rin could respond, the shrill beep of a motion sensor echoed through the tunnels. Both of them were on their feet in an instant, weapons drawn. They found us, Rin muttered, his jaw clenched. Siren's eyes narrowed, her body tense with anticipation. It's only a matter of time before they breach the entrance. Rin checked the power on his plasma rifle. Then let's make sure they regret it. They moved swiftly, setting up their final line of defense at the narrowest part of the tunnel. The sensors beeped again, closer this time. Rin could hear the faint hum of Dominion engines outside. How many do you think? Enough, Siren replied, her voice steady despite the tension. The ground began to tremble as the Dominion forces approached, their heavy boots reverberating through the tunnel. Rin and Siren exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a battle for everything they had come to mean to each other. When the first Dominion soldier appeared in the tunnel, Rin fired. His shot hit its mark, the soldier's armor cracking under the blast. But more followed, their exosuits gleaming in the dim light as they advanced. Siren leapt into the fray, her movements a blur as she disarmed one soldier after another with a deadly precision. The battle was fierce, the confined space of the tunnel turning every second into a fight for life. But as the enemy pressed forward, Rin could feel the weight of their numbers bearing down on them. We can't hold them off forever, he shouted over the roar of plasma fire. Siren, panting and bloodied but still standing, glanced at the cave's narrow exit. We don't need to, she said, a fire in her eyes. We just need to make sure none of them leave. With one final burst of energy, Rin and Siren activated the remaining explosives, sealing the tunnel in a deafening explosion of dust and rock. When the dust settled, they stood alone in the collapsing cave, victorious but trapped. The way out was blocked, but for the first time in a long time. Neither of them felt truly cornered. In the stillness that followed, Rin turned to Siren, his voice rough with exhaustion. Now Siren looked at him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Now, she said softly, we find a way to survive. Together, as the dust settled from the cave in, a heavy silence filled the air, broken only by the sound of falling pebbles and the faint hum of malfunctioning Dominion tech buried beneath the rubble. Rin leaned back against the cool rock wall, breathing hard. His rifle still gripped in his hand. His body ached from the fight, but his mind was already turning over their next move. We've sealed ourselves in, he muttered, glancing at the wall of rock now blocking the entrance to the mine. That buys us some time, but not much. They'll be back with reinforcements. And when they come, we'll be sitting ducks. Siren wiped a smear of blood from her forehead, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the cave. She was breathing heavily, but she didn't seem rattled by the situation. They'll send drones first, to scout for survivors, she said, her voice calm and steady. But they won't find us right away. The cave system is deeper than they realize. Ren pushed himself off the wall, his military training kicking in. Then we'll need to move farther inside, find another way out if there is one. He glanced at Siren. You've been down here before, right? Do you know of any exits? Siren shook her head. Not personally, but there were rumors about old escape tunnels from when this place was operational. If they exist, they're deep in the lower levels. But even if we find them, they could be collapsed or overrun by other things. Other things? Ryan raised an eyebrow. What kind of other things? Siren hesitated, her expression shadowed by something dark. The miners left for a reason. There are stories of creatures living deep underground, things that have been here since before the Dominion claimed this planet. Rin groaned, already feeling the weight of this new complication. Great. As if we didn't have enough problems already without wasting any more time, they began to move deeper into the cave system, following the narrow paths that led downward into the heart of the abandoned mine. The tunnels were damp and cold, with the occasional flicker of ancient, broken lights that struggled to illuminate the way. Their footsteps echoed softly, the only sound other than their breathing. It was eerie, the silence pressing in on them like the weight of the rock above. After what felt like hours, they reached a cavern larger than the others, its ceiling lost in the darkness. Old mining carts, rusted and broken, lay scattered across the floor, along with tools and equipment that had long since been abandoned. The walls here were smoother, polished by years of use, but there was an unsettling energy to the place. "We should rest here," Siren said, glancing around the chamber. "It's far enough from the entrance that we won't be found quickly, and we need to regain our strength before we push farther." Rin nodded in agreement. He was exhausted, his muscles aching from the fight and the long trek into the mines. As they set up a small camp in the cavern, using what little supplies they had left, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to move at the edges of his vision, and every now and then he thought he heard faint, skittering sounds from the darkness beyond. As they sat by the small glow of a portable heater, Rin broke the silence. "You never told me what exactly your father wants from you. Why go to all this trouble to track you down?" Siren sighed, her shoulders tensing as she stared into the dim light. "My father, Kyan Drex, isn't just a ruler, he's a tyrant. The Dominion runs on fear, and he maintains control through intimidation, through destruction. But he knows that power can't last forever. He fears losing his grip on the galaxy, and I represented a threat to that control." She paused, her voice heavy with bitterness. "I challenged him openly. I called for rebellion, for reform. I wanted to give our people hope, and for that, he cast me out. But it wasn't enough to exile me. He wants me dead so no one will follow my example." Rin frowned, trying to piece together the deeper layers of her story. "So what happens if he finds out you're still alive?" "He could just tell everyone you're gone." Siren's expression hardened. "It's not that simple. As long as I live, there's a chance I could return, a chance I could rally the people against him, and he can't allow that. So he'll stop at nothing to hunt me down." Rin stared at her, his mind spinning with the weight of her words. "And what about you? Do you still want to fight him?" She was silent for a long moment, her eyes lost in thought. "I don't know," she admitted finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I used to believe that change was possible, that I could overthrow my father and rebuild the Dominion into something better. But now, I'm not sure. So much has been lost." Rin nodded slowly, understanding her conflict. "Sometimes it's hard to keep fighting when everything feels hopeless." She met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the dim light. "But you keep fighting anyway." Rin shrugged. "I guess it's just who I am." Siren smiled faintly, a hint of warmth in her expression. "I'm starting to think it's who I am too." Their moment of quiet was shattered by a sudden noise, a deep, echoing rumble that reverberated through the cavern. Both of them were on their feet in an instant, weapons drawn. The sound came again, louder this time, like something large moving through the tunnels. "Looks like we're not alone," Rin muttered, his eyes scanning the darkness. Siren's face was tense, her body coiled like a spring ready to strike. "We need to move. Now." They grabbed their gear and quickly began to retreat deeper into the mines, following the winding paths that led farther away from the surface. The rumbling sounds followed them, growing louder with each step, accompanied by the unmistakable skittering of claws on stone. "What the hell is that?" Rin hissed, his heart pounding in his chest as they ran. Siren didn't answer, her face grim with concentration. Whatever was chasing them, it was fast and it was getting closer. As they rounded a bend in the tunnel, the ground beneath them suddenly gave way. Rin and Siren tumbled through the darkness, crashing into a lower chamber with a bone-jarring thud. Pain shot through Ran's body as he struggled to catch his breath, the wind knocked out of him by the fall. Siren groaned beside him, pushing herself up onto her knees. "Are you okay?" Rin winced as he stood, shaking off the dizziness. "I'll live," but as they looked up, their eyes widened in horror. The chamber they had fallen into was massive, its walls lined with ancient carvings and strange, glowing crystals embedded in the rock. But that wasn't what had caught their attention. In the center of the chamber, illuminated by the eerie glow of the crystals, stood a creature unlike anything Rin had ever seen. It was massive, its body a twisted amalgamation of rock and bone, with glowing red eyes and razor-sharp claws that scraped the ground as it moved. "It's one of them," Siren whispered, her voice barely audible. One of the creatures. The miners spoke of the creature let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes locking onto them. "We need to get out of here," Rin said, his voice tight with fear. But before they could move, the creature charged, its massive form barreling toward them with terrifying speed. Rin raised his rifle, firing off a volley of plasma shots, but the creature shrugged them off as if they were nothing. Siren moved swiftly, dodging its attacks with the grace and agility of a predator. But the creature was relentless, its claws swiping through the air with deadly precision. "This isn't working," Ren shouted, his heart racing. "We need a plan." Siren's eyes darted around the chamber, searching for something, anything that could help. Her gaze landed on the glowing crystals embedded in the walls. "The crystals," she shouted. "Shoot the crystals!" Ren crystal exploded in a brilliant flash of light. The creature recoiled, screeching in pain as the light seared its flesh. "Keep going," Siren yelled, moving to another crystal and blasting it with her plasma pistol. One by one, the crystals shattered, filling the chamber with blinding light. The creature let out one final, deafening roar before collapsing to the ground, its body dissolving into dust. For a moment, everything was still. Rin lowered his rifle, his chest heaving with exhaustion. "That was close." Siren nodded, her face pale but resolute. Too close they stood in the now silent chamber, surrounded by the remnants of the shattered crystals and the fading echoes of the creature's death throes. For a brief moment, they allowed themselves to breathe, to feel the weight of their survival. But they both knew this was just the beginning. As they looked at each other, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a bond forged in the fires of battle and the depths of despair. They weren't just allies anymore, they were partners. And whatever came next, they would face it together. "We need to find those tunnels," Siren said quietly, breaking the silence. Rin nodded. "And fast. The Dominion won't wait forever." With one last glance at the shattered crystals, they turned and continued their descent into the darkness, knowing that the path ahead was filled with danger, but also with the promise of something greater. Together they would find a way to survive, and together they would fight for a future worth living for.